In August of 1978, Olympic Airways Flight 411 accelerated down the runway. One of its engines exploded. But the aircraft had reached rotational speed, so there was no turning back. Without one of its engines, the plane struggled to climb quickly enough and threatened to stall. With the plane now headed to the densely populated city of Kallithea at such a low altitude, the pilot had to act fast. But what he did shocked everyone. This is the story of Olympic Airways Flight 411 and how a captain's out-of-the-box thinking saved 418 lives. It was a hot Greek summer's day on the 9th of August, 1978, when 400 passengers, most of whom were Americans heading back home from respective vacations in Greece, were set to board the massive Boeing 747 belonging to Greece flag carrier Olympic Airways. The flight was scheduled as Flight 411 and was set to depart in the 2 p.m. slot from Athens Ellinikon International Airport to JFK International Airport in New York. The aircraft being used was the massive Boeing 747-200 Quadjet, which was common in many airlines' fleets at the time and had first been delivered to Olympic Airways in 1973. Olympic Airways acquired a lot of 747s for its prime routes, including a non-stop route between Athens and New York. This meant that large numbers of American tourists could be accommodated in single flights at lower per-seat costs to the airline. However, the jet did have its fair share of troubles in the past. It housed the Pratt & Whitney JT9D turbofan engines, which were reportedly developed on an accelerated timetable and resulted in some engine flaws, thereby needing proper maintenance to run efficiently. There had even been an incident with American Airlines, where the JT9D's fan blades disintegrated after one of its engines exploded just seconds after takeoff. That incident was likely due to an ongoing pattern of the JT9D engine becoming overheated during starting procedures. Regardless of these problems, the 747 was still a popular aircraft, and the 400 passengers had no issues boarding the plane. Joining them were 18 crew members, including pilot in command, Captain Sifis Magidis, who had 32 years of experience flying with Olympic Airways. With him was First Officer Konstantinos Fikados, who was a seasoned pilot and a close friend of Magidis. Pre-flight checks were conducted by the crew, and the Boeing 747 was passed fit and given clearance for takeoff. Just before 2 p.m. local time, the plane was pushed back from the gate to prepare for takeoff. The weather condition, though clear, was quite hot at 32 degrees, and this potentially played a role in what was to come. Also to play a role was Athens' mountainous topography. Just after 2 p.m., the Boeing 747 began to taxi down runway 33R. The pilots noticed that the aircraft was a bit sluggish, but pushed on as this wasn't uncommon. However, just before liftoff, a loud explosion rocked the cabin. Engine number 3 had just suffered a catastrophic failure due to overheating. But at this point, the aircraft had surpassed its rotational speed, so it had to continue its ascent with an exploded engine. In the cabin, one of the flight attendants received an intercom message from a colleague at the back that the inboard engine on the right-hand side of the aircraft side had blown up. The colleague expressed their fears over the situation, to which the flight attendant affirmed it was as if they knew what was to come. Controllers in the tower observed in shock as they watched Flight 411 struggle to gain altitude while its shattered engine littered the runway with parts. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain was trying his best to force a performance out of the plane, but there were a few problems. Engine number 2 had undergone some maintenance, and so it wasn't performing at optimal levels, which made matters worse for the crew. Also, just after liftoff, the water flow warning sounded in the flight deck. Unfortunately, the flight crew misinterpreted the water flow warning as a water run-out warning, so they just decided to put off the water pump switch. Doing this with a damaged engine impacted the aircraft's ability to climb. However, the plane was somehow still able to take off eventually. But as the aircraft slowly took off, the flight crew found it difficult to gain both the required airspeed and altitude. However, despite needing more speed, Captain Magidis decided to immediately command a retraction of the landing gear at just 35 feet of altitude. This command was against Boeing's policies for the situation, because retracting the gear at that point would mean that the landing gear doors would open and then close, resulting in a temporary increase in drag. And at that point, any increase in drag would be enough to send the plane crashing back down. However, the first officer complied with the captain. This was because they had a hill in their flight path which would have been impossible to clear with the landing gear slowing the plane down. The captain was relying on his decades of experience. Once the landing gear was up, the plane gained a bit of altitude, but the 200-foot hill barely a mile away stood in the aircraft's way. The captain didn't have a choice, and so he pulled the nose of the aircraft up. All the airspeed that he had built up so far bled away, yet the 747 was able to clear the hill by just 9 feet. However, the danger was only just beginning. Climbing to avoid the hill cost the 747 precious airspeed, which was needed to keep the plane in the air. The captain was forced to drop the aircraft's nose to speed up or risk the jumbo jet just dropping out of the sky. The captain ultimately decided to trade about 50 feet of altitude for about 6 knots of airspeed, which was just able to prevent the aircraft from stalling. At this point, the aircraft was now flying only around 200 feet above Kallithea, a densely populated area of Athens. The area of Kallithea is the second most densely populated municipality in Greece, with over 100,000 inhabitants. Thus, an air crash in such a location would have caused devastating destruction and thousands of lives to be lost. The aircraft passed close to the Athens Tower complex, which is the tallest building in Greece. It was flying so low that it barely cleared the television antennas of some of the taller buildings in the Smyrna area. In fact, they were so low that some of the flight attendants were able to observe shocked expressions of people in nearby buildings as the jumbo jet flew by. The crew, who were barely managing to keep the aircraft airborne, now had to fly at a level altitude below 200 feet at a speed of 160 knots while being unable to turn. At that point, the captain's focus was on getting the plane away from the city and into an unpopulated area to at least reduce the potential loss of lives if the plane crashed. A translated recording from the captain revealed that he considered that it was over for everyone on board. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the passengers were unaware of what was going on, and some of them reportedly thought that they were on a planned sightseeing tour and started taking pictures. Regardless of what they thought, the aircraft was now headed for a collision with Mount Aigaleo, a few hundred feet ahead. With the situation of things, the crew knew that they couldn't overfly the mountain. But their luck changed when the flight engineer was able to successfully optimize the 3 remaining engines, which gave them some more power to work with. At the same time, a southwest sea breeze began to blow, bringing up the speed of the plane with the increasingly cooler air giving the plane a lift. The airspeed and altitude of the aircraft slowly began to creep up, but the ground beneath them was also rising. The captain knew that there was no way he could clear the mountain at the current airspeed, but he did have just enough to complete a banked turn without stalling. So he turned the plane out to sea and waited as the airspeed slowly picked up. When the aircraft hit 300 feet of altitude, the captain, now feeling more confident, decided to retract the flaps a bit. The aircraft was then able to climb to just over 1,500 feet, where he began dumping fuel to bring down its weight. With the plane much lighter, it was able to climb safely and could make its way back to Ellinikon International Airport. Against all odds, Flight 411 was able to land back in the airport without a single injury. Throughout the incident, communication with air traffic control was limited, and those at the control tower were relieved to see the aircraft make it back in one piece. It was unknown to him at the time, but by saving the lives of 418 people, Captain Magidis had just averted the 3rd worst air disaster of all time. The return of the aircraft was met with a wild applause on the ground. Captain Magidis exited the plane to see his 2 terrified but proud daughters waiting for him. The Greek National Air Safety Board that investigates aviation accidents and incidents wasn't established until 2004. However, the then Vice President of Customer Support at Boeing, Brian Weigel, did issue a report. In this report, he concluded that no malfunction in the airframe or engines caused the lack of performance following takeoff. Instead, they blamed the problem on the inadvertent shut-off of the water injection pumps by the flight crew, as well as the resulting decrease in thrust. He added that the loss of wet thrust in a situation where the aircraft was takeoff climb limited severely reduced the ability to continue the flight with any significant amount of positive climb gradient. Apparently, once thrust was manually increased at a coordination time of approximately 325 seconds, the aircraft climbed out in a normal manner. Contrary to what the captain said, the report didn't mention the explosion of engine number 3 as well as the power loss of other engines. Newspapers, on the other hand, reported that the engine 3 exploded during takeoff due to the overheating of the turbine cooling pipes. When investigators looked at the data from the recorders, they were quite shocked as to how Captain Magidis had managed to keep the plane in the air despite slowing down to 158 knots at one point. In fact, all Boeing simulations of the flight resulted in crashes. Following the incident, Olympic Airlines changed some of its procedures based on lessons learned from the flight. Although turning off the water pumps was blamed for the overheating and explosion of the number 3 engine, it was suggested by some that their primary purpose wasn't for cooling, but rather for improved performance. However, it was hard to deny that it played no role in the incident. Nevertheless, the consequences of such an occurrence were averted thanks to one man, Captain Magidis, because he could have stuck to Boeing's checklist and kept the landing gear extended. Fortunately for everyone on board and below, he didn't. He simply chose to trust in his experience and was able to think ahead and break the rules in a way that saved the lives of almost 500 people and potentially even thousands. The most impressive part is that he only had around 93 seconds to make his decisions. Incredibly, the same flight crew still ended up flying the passengers to New York on a replacement 747 at 6 p.m. the same day. As for the affected 747, reports noted that it stayed with Olympic Airways until 1985 before joining Trans World Airlines. It was finally retired in 1997 after 24 years of service. Magidis was reportedly so proud of the feat that he kept a copy of the flight data recorder with him as proof for whenever people doubted his tremendous story. In a 1994 interview, Magidis stated, "Those of us who survived that day are stowaways in life." The story of Olympic Airways Flight 411 was a lesson about trusting one's gut in the midst of a dangerous situation. Captain Magidis could have gone Boeing's way, but trusted in his ability to steer the massive aircraft through the crowd of buildings while still facing potential danger from surrounding hills. At the end of the day, Magidis triumphed against all odds, and no one could be more thankful for that than the other 417 people aboard Flight 411. What do you think about Captain Magidis' heroics? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, take care